Welcome back to 101 East. Now, it seems that Japan's younger generation is a little less resistant to the idea of dropping the country's no-war clause than are those who recall both Japan's war crimes and the atom bombs that devastated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As Fauzia Ibrahim reports, the young people are joining the Japanese self-defense force in ever-increasing numbers.
Of course I am ready to die. To die is not an easy matter, but if that kind of situation happened to me, I won't hesitate to offer my life in order to defend what I should protect.
18-year-old Takuma Matsu joined the self-defense force right after high school, driven by a desire to serve his country.
My friends were surprised when I said I wanted to join the SDF. Of course, they thought I would go to university, study hard, and go to work at an ordinary company. When they found out I wanted to join the SDF, where I would drive myself relentlessly, they were surprised and worried about me. I like the SDF because my two grandfathers were in the military. Its well-regulated life and purpose of duty are very noble, defending the country.
In the past, a career in the self-defense force seemed unattractive. The SDF was no more than an emergency and rescue unit. But with talk of a possible change in the country's constitution and the constant military threat from North Korea and China, the SDF is being perceived in a different light. Many in Japan now see the force as relevant and key to national security. While in the past it struggled for recruits, the SDF is now overwhelmed with applications. These women are on a day trip to experience life in the unit.
If people understand us more, we think we can achieve our aims. As I said before, the defense agency and the self-defense force belong to the people. We want the people to think of us as being theirs.
This public relations exercise goes a long way to boost support for changing Japan's pacifist stance.
At first, I thought our military forces in Japan were strange. But then I suddenly thought Japan should revise Article 9 of the Constitution and even introduce the draft.
Observers say such radical thinking is gaining in popularity, particularly among the youth. The post-war generations want to leave the shame of the past behind. For them, it's time for a newer, bolder Japan to emerge to take its place proudly in the world.
And our guests today are, in Tokyo, Hisahiko Okazaki, and in New York, Robert Dujarric. Here in the studio, Li Ming-jiang. Gentlemen, thank you for staying with us. Mr. Okazaki, let me come back to you if I might. Before we went to the break, you were speaking of a lessening of Japan's military spending over the past few years. But is that really a relevant measure when Japan's military spending per head is far, far greater than China's, even though Japan claims to be a pacifist nation?
Well, actually, the peace depends on the balance of power. And so far, a joint American and Japanese military strength is far superior to the Chinese. And that's the basic structure of the stability in East Asia. But we are alarmed by the very rapid increase of Chinese defense budget. Well, that's well, everybody in the world is watching the development.
Li Ming-jiang, Mr. Okazaki there speaks of alarm at China's rising military spending. But he's also pointing out that Japanese military capability right now far outweighs that of China. It's also backed up by US military power, which far outweighs everybody's. Where and who should be the cause for alarm?
Well, yes, if you look at the military comparison, Japan enjoys a lot of advantage as compared to China at this moment, of course. And again, you don't look at just the decline of Japanese military spending, you look at the total sum, which is still impressive, huge, as compared to China. And then if you compare other index per capita spending, that's even much higher than the Chinese spending. And as we all know, the Chinese military spending increased after 1995, 96. because of the Taiwan crisis. And then my sense is that the Chinese military expansion is a larger response to possible contingency over Taiwan.
Right.
It's not a direct targeted at Japan.
Robert Dujarric, let me put that to you. I mean, China's military inferiority should be a greater cause for alarm, shouldn't it, than Japan's fear that China may be changing the balance of power?
No, not of itself. I mean, first, when Mr. Lee talks about the Taiwan issue, he's basically talking about China's desire to invade and conquer Taiwan. So, it's the Taiwanese who should feel threatened, not China. We're essentially talking about a war of aggression.
We're not really...
Let me continue.
We're not really talking here about whether we should be demonizing China for its Taiwan policy. We're talking here about whether China's strategic military inferiority in Asia should be maintained as a matter of policy.
I think it's basically at this point something that guarantees not only the security of everybody, but the security of China as well. I think also your segment totally overstates Japanese militarism or interest in the military. I think the key fact is that you can see two things in Japan. Every year they spend less on defense, and the Japanese spend more than $2.5 billion on goods from Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy. Now, a country where this priority is given to buying Louis Vuitton handbags over spending on defense is not a militaristic country. It's one of the most pacifist countries on earth. It's because of the history issue that people unfortunately have, and this is a self-inflicted problem on the part of the Japanese government. They have a very mistaken idea of what Japan is.
I'm not entirely sure. I'm not entirely sure. Let me stop you there for a minute. That the amount of spending on Louis Vuitton handbags is necessarily a counterpoint to the fact that they spend far, far more on military than a pacifist nation might ordinarily be seen to. But Mr. Okazaki, there's also the issue of the actual capability of Japan's military force. For a pacifist nation, it has a bigger army, a better equipped army, and plans for even more spending on military defense in alliance with the US than most countries in the world. So what exactly is the cause for alarm?
Well, actually, we can't talk about only Japanese capability. I always consider it as a joint US-Japan alliance. And actually, the capability of joint US-Japan alliance is what President Bush said. It's a balance of power which favors freedom. It has been the case. And balance of power around China was in favor of the freedom side. But we are afraid that it's changing because of the rapid Chinese growth.
Let me bring up the case of one of the major problems between China and Japan, and that is the issue of Japan's wartime history and what seems like a government-based attempt to try and deny some of the elements of the history that seem to be making China very, very angry. How important is addressing that issue going to be to future relations?
Well, it's going to be very important, I think. It has been important, it is important, and it will continue to be important. If this history issue is not addressed properly, China's concern is really legitimate. What you have done to me, it was militarism, and now you are expanding military capability and military role, security role, and this is I think it's a legitimate concern.
Then to Mr. Okazaki, does Japan, in your perspective, have any intention of addressing that particular element of diplomatic face-off, as well as your concerns about the military imbalance here?
Well, actually, I have been in this business for a long time, and it's a very strange case. In the world history, the memory of the war fade away about one generation after the war. And actually, that's exactly what happened. And before 1980, there's no such thing as a historical issue. Around 1980, I stood for answering questions in the Diet for 300 times, and nobody, including Chinese or Korean or anybody, talked about Japanese historical past. It's a new issue. It's a very new issue, and Actually, that exists now since 1980, almost 25 years. So I think it came up. It's a very rare case in the world history. And also, it was produced somewhat for political purpose and artificially. Actually, it didn't exist in 1980. If there's anybody who can prove that he talked about the Japanese historical problem in the year 1980, and I don't think anybody has an evidence. Nobody talks about it.
Do you think, Mr. Dujarric, that this issue is going to be a significant one when we talk increasingly in the future about the balance of power in Asia?
I think what happened, to follow on Ambassador Okazaki's statement, is that when the Communist Party in China had a monopoly on power, it didn't care about the history issue, because in fact it was very grateful for Japan, because thanks to the Japanese invasion, the Communist Party was able to defeat the Kuomintang. What has happened in the past 20 years, as China's politics have changed, the Communist Party has had to rely on nationalism to develop a sense of loyalty to its rule, and it has used Japanese war crimes as a rallying cry. I think the history issue is actually perhaps even more relevant in relations with Korea, because Korea is a democratic society where complaints about how Japan handles its history issue really come from the Korean people. In China, it's very much manipulated by the government.
Let me give a final word to Dr. Lee then. This idea that bringing up the historical record in the service of politics is somehow manipulation, is that?
Well, I think that's to some extent true, but it's exaggerated. Well, Robert just made the comparison of China and South Korea, right? South Korea is a democracy, then it's arguably the anti-Japan, in terms of history issue, is perhaps as strong as that you can find in China, perhaps even stronger. So that does not explain, because of its communist state in China, politics was a reason. There's a very small part of it, I think. But the history issue, as Mr. Okazaki mentioned, back in the 1980s, even a decade prior to that, it was less contentious. That's true. Well, then the question we need to ask is why it's now more and more contentious.
And that's
my understanding is, yes, my understanding is because of domestic change in Japan.
Okay.
That the rightist thinking, rightist versions of history that's been, emerging in Japan in the late 1990s, that's really worrying China.
That, unfortunately, is a question we're going to have to leave for a future discussion, because that's all we have time for today. Gentlemen, I do appreciate you talking to us all today. That's all we have time for. From 101 East, it's goodbye.